early dawn, the women came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women. All these women got up early before dawn preparing spices for the body of Jesus that they thought they would find in a tomb. It turns out that this day, in which these women got up so early, would be a very long day indeed. By the end of the day, they would have met their risen Lord again. It will be the most important day of their lives, the day in which these women become the messengers of the best news ever delivered. They return from that empty tomb to tell their friends what had happened, that Jesus has risen. Their friends do not believe them. They don't believe it at all. They're tired. They're scared. They think they're next. They are so filled with worry and fear. And they do not believe these women who come and tell them this good news. In fact, our reading today tells us from Luke's Gospel that these very freaked out, afraid people think that the women are telling them idle tales, stories that are just nonsense. Sometimes we also hear news, and it is so impossible to us that we cannot absorb it. We rule it out as impossible, untrue. Like the apostles, we may have our doubts about the resurrection. Here's a funny thing. Since being ordained, when people find out I'm a priest, they want to tell me what questions they have, what doubts they have, as though they think I'll be able to resolve them. But it's nice to hear what people are struggling with, because I struggle too. Nobody has ever sat me down and said, "Dina, I struggle with believing the crucifixion." No one. For some reason, we have no trouble believing that human beings can do that kind of violence to one another. However, many people have sat me down and told me that they have doubts about the resurrection. Mainly because I think we have no experience of bodily resurrection. We can't imagine what that's like. The crucifixion we can imagine. that kind of pain and suffering and violence. But the joy of the resurrection, we don't have anything to go on. It's the bodily resurrection of Jesus that has many Christians hung up. Me too. It's a lot to absorb. I've never seen anyone become resurrected before. I have no experience of that. So let's be really clear. The apostles to whom these women go and say Jesus is risen, they do have experience with bodily resurrection. They have seen other people resurrected. Throughout the gospel accounts, we hear stories of them following Jesus into the city of Nain. They go into Nain, and as they try to enter the city, they can't go in. A whole group of the people from that city are walking out sad and crying and wailing. A widow's only son has died, and they are carrying him on their shoulders to the place where he will be buried. And Jesus says to the mother, "No need to cry anymore." And he stops the pallbearers and he says, "Just stop where you are." And he touches him. And he raises this only son of a widow back to life. And he sits up on their shoulders and starts talking. That is bodily resurrection. Nobody doubted what had happened when he started talking. Then there was the time that they were going somewhere to teach and to heal people, and an official of the Roman court named Jairus comes to find Jesus because his 12-year-old daughter is dying in his home. And he knows that Jesus is a healer, and so he sends somebody out to find Jesus, and he approaches Jesus himself, and he says, "Please, come to my house and heal my daughter. She's dying." And on his way there, Jesus heals somebody else, and it takes a while, and he doesn't get there right away. And before he gets to the house, somebody rushes out of the house and says, "Don't bother the teacher anymore. She's already dead." It's okay, but she's died. Jesus turns to the father, this Roman official, and says, "She's not going to be dead. It's okay. I'm going to go see her." And he goes into the house, and he says to her, "Talitha kum, little girl, get up." And she does. From being dead to being alive, she gets up, and then he tells the people in the house who are standing around unbelieving, even though they're seeing it, he says, "Give her something to eat." That's bodily resurrection. Feed her. She has a body again that needs food. And then there's that time that Jesus calls his friend Lazarus out of the tomb, 3 days dead. He comes out of the tomb in front of all of his friends, still wearing the burial clothing of death. The apostles who do not believe these women that Jesus was risen from the dead had experienced multiple times how Jesus could raise a dead person back to life. They witnessed other people resurrected. A son, a daughter, a friend. But now, for some reason, they think these women are making up stories. So let's look at the women. If we look at these women throughout the gospel accounts, we see women who are feeding Jesus and all the people that were traveling with him, women who have been healed by Jesus, forgiven by Jesus, drawn into his inner circle of followers in a way that is unusual for that era. They believe what Jesus is teaching. These women face the hard reality of the cross on Good Friday and never looked away from the horror. These were pragmatic, resilient, and hard-working women. They may have been exhausted, getting up before dawn and preparing those burial spices, moving about in that haze of grief, but these women were not liars. They didn't tell idle tales. Some of you will remember when a part of our world, Berlin, had this dividing wall in it. Did anybody travel to Berlin when the Berlin Wall was still standing and dividing East Berlin from West Berlin? If you grew up in the 70s and 80s as I did, you grew up thinking that it would always be like that. That the Soviet Union on the one side, and on the other side, the parts that had been given after World War II to be managed by the United Kingdom and France and the United States, that there would be this great divide and this wall between people in that city forever. A friend of a friend in 1989 was an American student living in Berlin, studying German and studying German history. He lived on the west side of that wall, of course, as an American student. One night, Paul was getting ready for bed. It was November 9th, 1989, and he was listening to the news, and he was getting ready for bed, and he heard somebody on the news say that the people of the German Democratic Republic, the East Germans, would be immediately permitted to freely travel without restrictions. Now, for those of you who do not remember, have not studied this era of history, people died trying to cross that wall. And as he hears that news that night, getting ready for bed, he thinks to himself, my German is not as good as I thought it was, because this cannot be possible. Here I thought I knew German pretty well. I've been studying it, but that can't be right. He goes to bed. He goes to sleep, and he is brought back to wakefulness by a sound he has never heard before. It is the sound of thousands of people celebrating in the streets of Berlin. Imagine Paul going outside to learn that indeed the restrictions had been lifted. The wall no longer separated east from west in Berlin. East Berliners who had not seen certain family members and friends since the 40s or the 50s rushed to find their people. Children met grandparents for the first time. It was a beautiful, unbelievable moment that Paul could not absorb easily. And over the next few months, the wall began to disappear, piece by piece. Some of us have pieces of this wall at home because it was chipped away by those celebrating masses, by tourists who visited, who took little bits home for friends and family members, flinging the bits of cement that had isolated and separated people, flinging those bits out to the ends of the earth, never to find their way back to where they could be set, one upon the other, and divide the people of Berlin again. Shocking, good news can take some time to absorb. We may not believe it when first we hear it. We need to hear it more than one way. We need to hear it more than one time. It may take shouts from city streets. It may take joyful celebration of a community like this one. When we hear that Jesus is resurrected from the grave, we may not know how to process that news. It may just seem too impossible. Unbelievable news takes time to absorb, maybe a lifetime. It's perplexing and mysterious and not like anything we have experienced in our lives. Here's the thing. Whether an American living in Berlin believed that the Berlin Wall had opened up or not, it still opened up, right? Whether he went back to bed in disbelief or he believed the news, it didn't change the fact that the wall had opened up. Whether or not we believe that Jesus has risen, the God who created us and the entire universe has the power to do this, has the power to raise Jesus out of a tomb. As a part of my own faith journey as a follower of Jesus, I have decided to claim this mystery of resurrection as true for my life. I have decided to believe what is beyond my comprehensive abilities. And believing this infuses my life with hope. But it takes time. It takes time to let go of my pride at wanting to comprehend clearly and completely with scientific evidence and proof that this really happened. It takes time for the truth of God's freeing love to sink in when I'm living in a world more familiar with crucifixion than resurrection. It takes hearing it over and over again every year at Easter. It takes crowds of celebrating believers to convince us that what we resist in believing may be indeed the truth we've been waiting for. The truth that God the Creator loves us so much that God is willing to break down all walls